Welcome to Zero Velocity. I'm your host, Brad Thorpe.
Today, we're talking about tendon health and how isometric-based exercise can help with it. And it's pretty extraordinary because tendons, for the most part, are never discussed in the realm of physical fitness. Physiotherapy, rehab, they're talked about all the time. Do you want to know why? Because basically 50% of the injuries that occur in humans are related to tendon structures. Whether you're an athlete or it's an occupational work environment, the majority of injuries that occur are related to your tendon structure. So why don't people talk about them? I mean, they're pretty simple. All they do is connect bone to muscle. That's all they do. The problem is they're wicked complicated, and people just don't understand them very much. And we're going to keep this conversation simple today in the sense that we're not going to try to overwhelm you with the complexity of this tissue structure. I mean, it is viscoelastic. What? Yeah, it has the ability to go from rigid to elastic. It's truly awesome. Now, the interesting thing is, I mentioned something a second ago that was related to muscles, and each muscle has multiple tendons. And the reason I say multiple is because muscles are not necessarily just a straight line. Some are kind of complex. I mean, you get into your flexor digitorum longus, flexor digitorum brevis, and it's like, what are those? Those are foot muscles. And they have 5 toes, so these tendons branch off from the muscles. So they get really, really complex. So here's the cool thing. There's roughly 650 muscles in your body, give or take a couple. There are over 4,000 tendons in your body. Boom. Hold on, that means each muscle doesn't just have one tendon. Or maybe we've tried to simplify it so we can have a grasp of this unbelievable thing that we call the human body. So cool things about the tendon that we want to look at is the fact that it does transmit force from a muscle to the bone. It also has the ability to elongate. It has the ability to stay still. There's almost like it's remember back in the 80s when people used to crimp their hair, you get these little wavy sort of things within their hair. Thank God, to be honest, that trend died. And hopefully it doesn't come back in the next couple months because I noticed my daughter today, she had acid wash jeans on. So 80s are coming back hardcore, so hopefully not crimping. But anyways, side note. But when looking at that crimping, what happens when a muscle contracts, it sort of unloads or basically uncrimps that tendon structure, so it elongates a little bit. And then it transmits force into the bone with the goal, traditionally, to create movement. That's outstanding. Now, over the last sort of several years, to be honest, I've been reading a ton of research on tendons and what you do to prevent injury and how you speed up the recovery from different types of tendinopathies, whether it's tendonitis, which is the inflammation of tendon structure. Sorry, I'm just gonna fix my Zenkai shirt there. It's all crumpled up. You remember that sort of crimp I was talking about a second ago? So crimp is like all this stuff. And then it's like, boom, that generates force. It looks so much better when you have it flat. But anyways, Zenkai Sports, you guys rock. And when the uncrimping of that tendon, so potentially with athletic exercises, sport, occupational, like if you're a factory worker and you're doing repetitive stuff, what can happen is you end up injuring that tendon. Traditionally, if the load is light and it's more repetitive in nature, it's tendonitis, right? That's where you get this inflammation of the tendon. It is annoying, it's painful, it's debilitating, and it's not something that you necessarily want. However, it can heal. It traditionally takes between 4 and 6 weeks to heal. Now, there's this other thing that's a little bit more serious. It's called tendinosis. That's when you have a high force issue when you actually injure that tissue. And sometimes it just never gets better, right? Some literature will sort of say it's almost like a Swiss cheesing effect of the tissue makeup, where you get like little holes within the structure. That's really bad in the sense that it doesn't heal properly. It's not going to help transmit force better, and it's going to basically be in a heightened state of just, irritants are sort of saying, like, wah, wah, wah. Like it's like this signal going off saying, hey, you're screwed up. So maybe we need to step back a little bit. So, interesting tidbit, in all the studies that I read, 100% of the participants were basically injured because of movement. Let that resonate for a second. 100% of the participants, whether it was a running study, a lifting study, I'm an occupational worker study, they were all injured because of movement. So let's explore that. Why are they injured because of movement? Is movement damaging to tissue? Well, yeah, it can be if you're not prepared for it. Now, one of the things that happens is they will traditionally, be it physical therapists, manual therapists, will turn to isometric-based exercise after somebody's injured, because it's the safest way to apply force to structure. You can be extremely strategic in the structures you try to address when looking at a specific force angle and how you apply force to structure. And if you're looking at return to play after a orthopedic injury, it is always step one, introduction of isometric exercise. So why, and this frustrates me to no end, why don't we do it before we get injured? There is the easiest solution to how you resolve tendon pain and tendon injury. You actually strategically try to target tendon. And remember, I said there's like 4,000 of them in the human body. So you have to be kind of strategic. You can do the guess, hope, and pray, which is maybe works. You could sort of say, hey, I want to look at my long head bicep tendon. How do I actually apply force specifically to that one? But what about my short head bicep tendon? Right? Because they bifurcate, meaning they go into two little different parts. So you have your long head tendon comes up here, forms the joint capsule, and then you got your short head comes under there, and it actually attaches the coracoid process of your scapula. If you put those two destinations in Google Maps, I guarantee you 100% of the time, you will never end up in the same location. Right? They have a common attachment down here, down on your radius. But at the two sort of proximal tendon attachments, they're totally different. So we need a different approach to target specifically the short head tendon at the proximal end and the long head tendon at the proximal end. And this is just one of the 650 different muscles. Now that could become very paralyzing. But one thing that I can pretty much guarantee you is the guess, hope, and pray approach is less effective, less efficient, and less than optimal. So how do we how do we target that bicep? Well, guess what? It's actually pretty simple. If, let's say this is a fixed bar, I can now curl that up. Well, if I use my left arm, so if I curl that up, I can sort of see that muscle engaging. I may need to internally rotate and flex for my short head. I may need to externally rotate and flex for my long head to skew that resultant force to the tissue I want to target. Now, if you're just doing the standard bicep curl, well, you're hoping that you're actually strategically putting tension on those tendons. Now, is that to say that there's going to be no tension? No, there's going to be some. It's just going to be fluctuating up and down. Now, the interesting thing about tendons, they do require a fair bit of consistent load to affect the quality of their structure. Now, one of the things that we're going to explore, so we're just going to pull this up, right? So remember where I said that tendons were basically quite often injured? So this comes from the mechanical and material tendon properties in patients with proximal patellar tendinopathy, and that's from the Frontiers of Physiology, and that was in 2020. So tendinopathy is a multifactorial tissue disorder responsible for almost every second sport or occupational related injury and impedes physical function and performance, right? So we already discussed that a little bit, but let that resonate. Almost every second, so we're just under 50% of sport and occupational related injury. So that's a huge number of people that we can help out if we decide to just simply change our approach to how we prepare for movement, right? Because as we've discussed in previous shows, the participation of sport is basically the practice of. Isometric-based exercise and strength training is the participation or the how you prepare for it phase. Like, I want to prepare for it. Okay, so as we discussed, remember to keep audio. Oh yes, thank you guys. They're just sort of firing me off notes there, and it's bouncing across my screen. So you guys can't see that on our Spotify people, so sorry about that. So anyways, guys, so here's what happens when you have low force on tendons. And this is where it's tendon biomechanics and mechanobiology. Wow, that's a kind of a crazy thing. So if you have low force on tendon, the tensile strength decreases, the size decreases, the collagen production decreases, the anabolic activities decrease, and the catabolic activities increase. So meaning the tendon's going to get weaker, less functional, less optimal if you don't apply force to that structure. And this is where you have to have a strategic mindset, because there's all these muscles in your back that you don't know the names of. They're really tiny, small things, but they also have tendons, right? That's why there's so many of them. You know, you can call it your multifidus. There's different segments of those, your semispinalis, thoracis, ilicostalis, longissimus, thoracis, and cervicus. There's a ton of stuff back there that we need to be strategic for. But let's look at what happens when you apply a moderate amount of sort of force to the structure. Well, increase in tensile strength, increase collagen synthesis, decrease in collagen degradation. I can't say that, my word. What word is that? Degradation. I said it wrong again. Decrease adhesions and decrease inflammatory mediators. Man, I gotta learn how to speak better. I was in the woods for 4 days not talking to many people. Actually, I was cutting trees. It's pretty cool. And also an increase in tendon stem cells, differentiating into tenocytes, right? So what does this mean to you guys? So if you apply a moderate amount of force to tendons, they will learn how to function better. They will get more resilient, and they're less likely to be injured. So too little, not good. A moderate amount seems to be great. Do you guys feel like you're like Goldilocks right now, trying out some porridges? I think so. This one's too hot. This one's too cold. This one's just right. So let's see what happens when we apply too much force to tendons. All right, so if we apply an excessive amount of force, you're going to have a decrease in tensile strength. Wow, that's pretty unique. Hold on, I figured more force would equal higher levels of tension. No, not in this case. The muscle may get stronger, but the tendon becomes more vulnerable. That's why there's a ton of tendon issues associated with sports and occupational athletes. We don't sort of put two and two together, right? So if we have the decreased collagen organization, so things get all jumbled up when you get all messed up, your myofibroblasts increase, those are not good. Inflammatory mediators. Oh, inflammation goes up. What? Remember that tendonitis? That's crazy. And remember that TS, whatever those, I forget what it is. I'm going to jump back one set. The tendon stem cells, that's what your TSA is differentiating. So they go up, and also your leukotriens, hashtag edema, swelling, right? So if you apply too much excessive tendon or force to tendons, they get worse. They put you at risk of injury. So how do you ramp up force on tendons? Well, the cool thing about isometric loading is it's consistent, it's safer, so you're not going to have a fluctuating in load as I change throughout a range. Now, most of you out there, I'm going to assume, do not understand the physics of exercise. But there's this thing, it's called the moment arb. And that's one of those things that is vital in determining what muscles participate in an activity and how much load is going to be affecting that specific tissue, right? It's also used in the calculation of this physics term called torque, which is basically just a rotational force. And when you're looking at this stuff, so that moment arm is going to dictate how much force is in there. And we know that force is basically mass times acceleration. In an isometric contraction, well, because there's not much acceleration, and there is some, but what happens is the goal is actually not to create changes in length, but apply tension or stress to specific tissues within the body. So in an isometric-based contraction, what we're able to do, and we can take that slide down if you want. I'm going to have some coffee, just because my mouth is getting dry. The tendon, what happens is when I start to apply some force to that structure, the change doesn't occur in the muscle length, right? So now what happens is the muscle is attempting to shorten, provided you're putting forth the effort versus just, I'm just going to statically hold here and do nothing. But if I'm applying force into my left arm, well, right now, the interesting thing is, so all of those muscles that would cross that joint, right, those tendons that are responsible for those movements, what will happen is now I'm going to start stimulating those tissues. And if I don't, give them too much heat, right, think of that oatmeal sort of analogy. If I'm able to give the right amount of force. Now, the interesting thing is, if I'm doing bicep curls, as I fatigue, that muscle starts to fatigue, that load incrementally goes up based off my fatigue setting or my fatigue state, right? So let's say you're curling 50 pounds, so a modest amount of weight. So if I'm curling 50 pounds and I'm doing reps and I'm getting tired, you guys remember it starts getting heavier. So that load will actually functionally start going up. Versus if I'm pulling into a fixed object and I start to fatigue, that load will go down because my force output is going to start dropping. So what we're able to do is keep a sustained length of a contraction. And what will happen is that tissue will then go through all those beautiful things in that moderate section of how you apply force, right? That increase in tensile strength, that increase in thickening, that increase. Now, the interesting thing is you can also increase the elastic quality of tendon structure, right? So not only do you increase the stiffness characteristics, you can also increase the elastic quality. So it's going to be more resilient, right? You have all these spinal muscles that you have to think about. Like traditional back exercises consist of a lat pull down. They consist of deadlifts. You may get into sort of some glute ham sort of back extension exercises, but they're going through a lot of stuff. My recommendation would be to start holding positioned within space where you're pulling into an immovable object. Don't think in terms of a sort of a stopped deadlift where you're stopping mid-range. That's not what I'm trying to accomplish here. What you want to do is sort of think spinal extension where you're dictating those forces because we don't want to give too much excessive force to this structure. And one of the things that we will see over time is a decrease in the amount of tendon injuries that people basically go through. And we're not going to spend too much time today just because the subject area is so complex. We're going to come back in a couple weeks and we're going to start diving into the complexity of the properties right? So today is just basically, let's start to explore some stuff. You got some tendonitis, you got some tendinopathy or a tendinosis going on. Start implementing some isometric-based stuff. And once you get outside of that 6-week return to play type protocol or rehab type stuff, focus on your isometrics. Do them daily. Don't go through the rigmarole of, oh, well, isometrics was great for getting me back to the game, but now let's not use them anymore, because that's traditionally what happens. I spend a ton of time dealing with individuals who have been hurt in sport or occupational workplace injuries. And what happens is once pain resides, people sort of say, okay, well, I don't need to do those isometrics anymore. And that is one of the biggest mistakes people do. They wake up, they do their isometrics, and they stop doing their isometrics because they don't have any pain anymore. And if you want to prevent injury or dramatically reduce the occurrence of it, add in isometric-based exercise. Obviously, our sponsor, ISOPHIT, is a great resource for that. So if you want to check out isophitmedia.com, and you can sign up and you get all kinds of insights into what type of exercises. There's a whole tutorial place, whether it's, you got tendonitis of your patellar tendon or your quadricep tendon. So one is below, one is above it. And that patella sort of situates right in it. If you're dealing with Achilles tendon issues, right, learning how to work other muscles that would aid in plantar flexion, right, that don't attach to your Achilles tendon, like your tibialis posterior. It goes underneath. Now, an interesting sort of note on the patella or the tibialis posterior tendon. Now, the muscle itself has 7 attachment sites to your foot, right? So it's got multiple kind of tendons, which it makes it really kind of unique in the sense that it's basically forms the arch of your foot. Now, I was dealing with a person several years ago who participated in yoga, and they excelled at yoga. Their goal was to do a lot of downward facing dogs. And this isn't a knock on yoga, but a lot of people who get really, really good at it have usually elongated their ligament structure, stretched their tendons. And what happens when you stretch a tendon repeatedly? It degrades. It degrades to the point where it doesn't necessarily function anymore. Because when it lengthens, the muscle shortens, and if there's too much laxity to that tendon structure, well, the muscle will pull, and you will actually pull the slack created in that lengthening of the tissue, and you won't transmit force. Now, unfortunately, this individual lost the ability to walk because they couldn't generate force to move forward. They couldn't propulse anymore. They went in and had a successful surgery and are walking quite well now, but what they had to do was basically overlay the tendon and sew it up. Not very complicated until you get into the region that it was affected. So these are some important side notes that you guys want to think about when you're looking at, I'm going to stretch, I'm going to do too much excessive loading to tendons, right? Because you don't want to traumatize, you don't want to cause inflammation, because what happens is when you cause that inflammation or that edema, and you keep like those repetitions, right? Those repetitions on an inflamed tissue just leads to the further degradation of that tissue structure. It causes agitation, leads to excessive pain, and eventually it will start to break down that structure. Anyways, if you need more assistance or understanding into the benefits of isometrics and how it can help you return to sport, get back to your job, or just basically live a pain-free, high-performing, active lifestyle, send us a message. My personal email is brad@isophit.com. Feel free to reach out at any point in time, and if we can help you, we're more than happy to. Peace out. We'll see you next week on the next episode of Zero Velocity Podcast.